Good morning, everyone. And, for once, I'm talking to people that love space. Normally I talk in a lot of conferences where I have to convince everyone how unreal space is, so it's good to be here. And it's good to be here with a lot of the people from my company. They're over there somewhere, and at least one of them's been with us a very, very long time, at least two probably. It's good to see you. So I'm going to talk about lessons learned on the orbital launch as well, but I want to talk a little bit about the journey to get there, because when you're building rockets, you don't just go straight to an orbital vehicle. You want to test a lot of things along the way. So very, very early in the company's history, we decided that we had to launch some kind of a hybrid rocket, and this really came out of a meeting I had with NASA at Kennedy Space Center a long time ago. They invited a lot of rocket companies over there because they wanted them to launch at Kennedy. And they lined them all up. I was sitting next to someone from SpaceX, and I was really chuffed at that because we'd only been around for a year. And they said, of all the new space companies, nobody had launched a rocket yet. And so I went back and said, right, guys, we've got to put a rocket together and we've got to launch one so we can differentiate ourselves. And this one was quite successful. Then after that, we raised capital. So, the space industry needs a lot of capital. And so it was very good for us to go into the market, and we got investment from Australia's largest venture capital company. They're the largest now. They were pretty big back then. And we operated in about 140 square metre factory on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Then we kept working on bigger and bigger rocket engines, and we started working on a larger suborbital rocket. Then we raised another round of funding in 2018. This was when the space agency came along. So we started this rocket company before there was a space agency. We started this company when there was actually a regulation that almost prohibited launch in Australia. So I was pretty confident that laws would change, and they did. Then we drove 2,000 kilometres out into the middle of Australia, into an area that I think is very, very similar to what I would imagine the surface of Mars looks like. And so, this was an amazing place to do our first larger suborbital test, which failed. And so this is where I'm going to start talking about the lessons learned. So one of the things that you hear about in the space industry, I think in other industries as well, is test like you're flying. So test like you're flying. And it sounds easy to do, but it's hard operationally. So in the example of why this rocket went wrong, this was a pressure-fed hybrid engine, and we had a pressure sensor that was inside the tank that went up to a regulator. And in the instruction manual, it said connect the pressure sensor directly to the regulator, but we connected it to the flight computer and then back down to the computer on the pressure regulator. That trip time of that information was about another 100th of a second or 500ths of a second. And that was just enough time for it to be too slow to close the valve and stop an overpressurization event to then separate the rocket. I jokingly tell people this was a suborbital flight of, at least the first half of it. And so, that was a big lesson about, test as you fly. And I'm going to, say that again and again and again. So after that, we started to, we said, okay, we've done a suborbital test. Let's go for an orbital vehicle now. We're going to really have a go. And so we started testing even bigger engines. And we moved into bigger factories, and then we started making all the other bits of the rocket. So one of the things that I thought about when I was starting the space company is I'd done research on other rocket companies, and they spend forever building their rocket engines. And so I said, all right, we'll spend a time building rocket engines, and then once we've got some decent rocket engines, we'll start hiring the rest of the business. The mechanical engineers to do the structures, avionics engineers, software people. And so this is what we started doing. We also started building satellites as well a few years ago. And then we got another round of funding. So if you talk to any rocket company that's done an orbital launch, they'll talk about all this funding that they have to get, and you really do need a lot of money. And we've actually gotten to the pad on a lot less money than a lot of our competitors, particularly in the United States, which we're proud of. And we won a very big government grant to expand into a larger factory. So one of the problems we had building orbital vehicles in Australia is there's no launch sites in Australia. There wasn't back then. And so we were getting ready and building a rocket, and you saw it in the last picture, and we still didn't have a launch site. And we were kind of hoping that the government would do something about a launch site, and we realized they weren't. So we said to ourselves, right, we've got to go and build a launch site now. So I co-founded the company with my brother, and I just gave him a mission. I said, go north into North Queensland and find a location to build a launch site. And then we found a really great place that was in a Queensland government state development area, in a secure area that had security fences around it. But it was a cow paddock. And when we did the launch, bit of a funny story, a lot of the media said the Gilmours launched a rocket in a cow paddock, and I got really offended by that. But then you go down to the launch site and you do see cows. So I was like, okay, they're calling it as they see it, as we say in Australia. But in about 2.5 years, it turned into this. And this is Australia's first space agency approved orbital launch site. And so we're pretty happy with that. And in this facility, we have a vehicle assembly building, all of our fluid systems, obviously the launch tower, transporter erector, launch table, just like every other rocket company in the world, I guess. I think the difference was, we were doing this for the first time. And so a tremendous amount of research and development was in almost everything we did. And I'm very happy to say that in the first test flight, all of the launch systems worked, as we say in the space industry, nominally, which was really, really good. Yeah, I keep putting investor rounds up. I just want to give you the idea that you got to keep getting money, So one of the lessons learned about space technology and rockets in particular is it always, always, always takes longer than you think to build a rocket. Anything super complicated, there's all these things that come up and you don't realize them. So, one of the lessons learned is whatever you think it's going to take to make something very complicated, double it. And you're around about close to that. And I remember going to an IAC in Washington, whenever that was, 2020, 2022. When was it? Okay, cool, close. And I had the privilege of speaking to a NASA boss that was director of commercial crew. And I said to him, all of the commercial crew vehicles are late from when they were supposed to fly. Does that bother you? And he said, no, it doesn't bother us, because whatever the space company tells us they're going to deliver by, we just double the date. And so they're on track. I was like, okay. Elon does this, and he's got a much, much bigger rocket. But, all the rocket companies do this. I started small, I got bigger. But this just gives you an idea that, you have to start small to learn as you build up to bigger rockets. I talked about this before, but as I said, it always takes longer than you think. So, we were thinking that we could do a launch in 2022, back earlier on. So a lot of articles came out that we were having a go at 2022. Then another article talked about being stuck on the launch pad. We had the rocket up at the launch pad for 18 months before we finally launched, and I'll talk about that in a little while as well. I talked earlier about our satellite program. So we launched on a SpaceX transporter mission earlier in the year, our satellite. It's operational in orbit. Took us about a month and a half. My head of satellites is here to commission it, and we're really happy that the first satellite we put up in space worked really well. It's about a 100 kilogram class satellite. And we had our first test launch on the 30th of July 2025, and we had 14 seconds of flight time, 23 seconds of engine burn time, and we have obviously gotten a lot of data out of it, a lot of information, and we're pretty happy with it. I think, for the amount of time that it was up at the launch site, waiting to get launched. We're about 1 kilometre away from the ocean. There's a lot of corrosion there. So before the launch, I had a lot of investors and government people saying, what's your chances of success on this? And I said, look, if we get off the pad, that's fantastic, because it's an old clunky rocket. Rockets aren't designed to be at the launch site for 18 months. And so I was very happy to see that. And I know a lot of people in Australia watched the launch. And in the IAC, we've been here for the last 4 days, and we've had a lot of people come and tell us, good job, fantastic. And that means a lot to us. So I really appreciate all the people that have come and said good job, including the Minister, Tim Ayres, who called me on the day we launched and said that was fantastic. So I'm just going to spend about 5 minutes on lessons learnt. So I think one of the things that we underestimated, and I think the government underestimated, was how long it was going to take to get all the regulatory approvals done in a timely manner, because it was the first time that we'd done it. And there's a lot of complexity in launching rockets. So you don't just have to get a permit from the Australian Space Agency. You have to get an environmental permit for the launch site. You have to get environmental permits to launch over the Great Barrier Reef. We had to get 24 different permits from the Queensland government. So there were so many authorities. We had to get flight permits from Civil Aviation Authority, sea permits from the Maritime Authority. And so all of these things take a long time to do, and you have to resource them properly. So we didn't have enough people working on this side of the business, and the approval processes just took way too long. And we've been talking with the Space Agency about the lessons learned, and we had a fantastic all-day session a few weeks ago where we went over and did like a hot wash on, what went wrong, where were the barriers, what could we do better. And our head of legal was in the meeting at the beginning, and he said, look, the good news is all of the information that was needed for the launch was available. And the Space Agency and the Civil Aviation Authority eventually got it. And so, the trick for us as a nation now is to figure out how do we get all of that information over to the regulators in a timely manner so that we don't have vehicles that are ready to go sitting on the pad for too long. In terms of the technology, I think one of the things that we learned was, testing like you fly is really, really, really important. It looks like what went wrong on the launch is something that we'd never tested close enough to the launch conditions before. We'd obviously tested the system before, but we hadn't tested it in close enough environments. And I think one of the critical things I can say about, doing testing is it's a juggle on, do you test all the subsystems first before you put them on the rocket and then you fly, or do you just chuck them all on the rocket kind of SpaceX style and let it rip? And one of the challenges to doing that is if you think, as we did, that we were going to launch, say, in 2024, and we sent the rocket up there to launch, we skipped a lot of the testing that we otherwise would have done. And so I was reflecting on this and thinking that if there are people out there that are also building, tough technology, and I'm doing this right now, it's good to have a scenario play where you say, okay, I think the next vehicle is going to be ready in June next year. if it's not ready until December next year, what other things would I do? What other processes, what other tests would I do? And that's a good thing to have in your back pocket. And one of my real regrets is we could have done a lot more testing on the rocket if we'd have known it was going to be another 18 months. I'm going to I think that's my last slide. I'm going to pause. I do a lot of presentations and I always burn through them, so I'm doing my usual. Okay. Okay, the first question is the question I get asked all the time from investors. What's the commercial niche you aim for in Gilmour? How do you differentiate yourself from SpaceX's Falcon 9, Rocket Lab Electron, etc.? So the main pitch to investors is that there are far, far, far more satellites getting built right now that need to launch in the next 5 years than there are available rockets. And I'm amazed how that's not well understood in the industry and why there isn't more panic out there. Because if I was a satellite operator, I'd be really nervous about being able to get my satellites up into space. The second point is that space is not like Star Wars, unfortunately. So you can't just go up there in a Millennium Falcon and fly all over the place and then drop satellites off. Because of physics, when you go to orbital velocity, you are traveling so quickly that it's very, very hard to change direction. And so I like to give an example that if you're in orbit and you want to change your inclination by 30%, that's the same delta V, which is a term we use for like energy, as going from low Earth orbit to the moon. So it's a massive amount of energy. So it's far more energy efficient to use a smaller rocket to go up to all these different places. And that's why we're seeing Electron launching so frequently, because that's where the demand is. So SpaceX is like an A380. It's the cheapest to go from a massive capital city to another massive capital city. We're like a 737 or even a business jet. We're cheaper to go from smaller city to smaller city than an A380. So what's another good one? What's the most important skill for young professionals and graduates to develop in the space industry? So we had a whole lot of rocket or space students. Well, we talked to a few days ago, and we said, the most important thing you can do is to build things, test them, fail, learn from the failings, fix it, and see success. And we don't really care if it's a rocket engine or it's a car or a drone. It's very, very important in the space industry to understand failure and to learn from failure. And if there's anything that I think my company does really, really well is understand failure and learn from failure. Since both of you brothers came from the banking industry rather than engineering, what led you to enter the space launch industry? What was the biggest challenge? Was that a technical background? So I am a banker, 20 years, financial markets, that became a rocket dude. Lessons learned from that is you can be amazed how much you can learn from reading books and papers. And I often say this to engineers that work for us: how much did you really learn in the lecture theatre vis-a-vis reading the books and doing the projects? And so I think the difference that we make in our company being non-engineers is we focus on the money. And I tell you, if you don't focus on the money, you can spend a lot on rockets. And so it's good to have a lens to say, okay, does that $1 million test get us enough information that we need or not? Is there another way to do that? And I think that's one of the reasons why we got to the pad, cheaper than almost any company on Earth. What was the investor response to the first flight? So the response was really good. So we did a very good job on educating our investors on the fact that Nobody's gone to space on their first attempt. Well, I mean, Blue Origin did, but Jeff chucked in $15 billion. I don't count that one. Everybody else has failed. The average of every rocket company that's gone to orbit is 3 launch attempts before they get to orbit. The mightiest of all, SpaceX, took 4. And so our investors knew that we were not going to get to orbit in the first mission and that it would take us time. But they also knew that getting off the pad is also very difficult. I think I calculated that in the Western world, non-government rockets, so commercial companies, there's only 6 companies that are still alive today that have gotten a rocket off the pad, and that includes SpaceX. So it's a very rare universe that you're in when you get off the pad. What does the future look like for Gilmour Space and launch it in Australia? I think the future looks fantastic. If you look at all the building blocks of what the country's done, we now have rules and regulations that permit orbital launches. We've got one. We have rules and regulations that permit launch sites to launch orbitally. We've got one of those as well, and there's other companies that are working on that. I think there's at least 4 or 5 companies in Australia that have satellites operationally working in space, which is really, really good. And we are well capitalized. We are going to be launching again next year. We're going to be doing more launch attempts, so we're not going to give up. So I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see more launches out of Australia. You may see other rocket companies come here and launch as well. A lot more satellites go up. So I'm as optimistic as I've ever been about the industry in Australia. Why was the launch not scrapped following the avionics failure? Was it a result of external pressure? So that's a really good question, because it also talks about R&D process and how quickly you can turn things around. So when we had the payload fairing fall off, we went through an internal investigation. We found out what went wrong that made the payload fairing go off. We put a fix in, we tested the fix, and then we were ready to fly again. And that's the right way to do it. You don't have to abandon the launch attempt. As long as you can identify the problem, fix it, test it, you can fly again, and that's what all the other rocket companies do around the world. Is the Australian government funding the domestic sector enough? I mean, I'm always going to say no, but we'll see. I think, the government has refocused on space in the new term. We're hearing very positive messages from the government. What I think is really important is that we come up with a national space strategy. And what I think will really boost the industry is a national space mission. And so I think, if I can hear the government talking about a national space mission, I think that's going to be where we really go bananas. What regulatory improvements are we expecting for future flights? Is the space agency on board? Yes, they are. They're very on board, and I'm very confident we'll be able to launch in the future when we need to. What's the TNT equivalent of the propellant? Very, very low. Because we use hybrid engines and they're 2 different phases of material, you can't get catastrophic explosions. So if any of you saw the failure, it basically landed on the ground, and no explosions, a very small fire. We were jokingly thinking, the GNC guys, if we put legs on the rocket, we might have even been able to land it, and then I could have just said, haha, it was a hop test, but we didn't. Since the launch industry alone is known to have a challenging business model, do you plan to expand into other areas? Yes, we are. We've started working in the satellite business as well, and we think that's got massive potential as well. There's an engineer here. Do you have composite technology for tanks like helium? Yes, we do. what rocket fuels do you favour? Is there a route to making these sustainable? I think one of the things that I'm happy to see in the space industry, and particularly the launch industry, is a move towards what we call green propellants, where the outcome of your rocket exhaust doesn't hurt the environment too much. So the main thing that comes out of our engines is water and carbon dioxide, and water more than carbon dioxide almost. So our type of propulsion system is labelled green in the industry, and I'm happy about that. Another question about sustainability. So this question is what I hear all the time. I've got 2 minutes left. I won't blow it. People are worried about how many satellites are going into space. So one of my solutions to that is there's enough atmosphere up to about 500 kilometers that satellites naturally deorbit and burn up in the atmosphere. So one of the things that I'd like to see happen across the world is the far majority of low Earth orbit satellites get launched between 400 and 500 kilometers. And so if anything goes wrong, they just naturally come back. It's like a self-cleaning mechanism. I'm very nervous about all the stuff that goes up to 1,000 kilometers, because if the satellite dies, it's very hard to take that satellite back again. I'll do one more question. Why did you choose Australia? I'm Australian. And as I said before, we got everything we need in this country to go to orbit, and we will. As a nation, we'll go to orbit, and we'll go further than orbit. And I'd love to join NASA and India and Japan and Korea and do missions to the moon and beyond. And I think we can do that from here. So keep going, and good luck to everybody.